May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Well, this sermon is going to be a fourth in a series of messages based on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In the first message, you recall, we talked about the Beatitudes, these short sayings in which Jesus summarized what life in the kingdom is about. And he described the attitudes of our heart that he is concerned about. Then two weeks ago, we talked about how Jesus called us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And last week, we talked about how Jesus came and said he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. In today's gospel, we have perhaps one of the most challenging teachings of Jesus in all the New Testament. Because in this passage that we just heard read to us, Jesus tells us that if someone strikes us on the cheek, we should turn the other. And he says if someone forces you to walk a mile, that you should walk a second mile. And Jesus tells his disciples to love their enemies and to pray for those who persecute them. Now, I don't think that this passage is prescribing pacifism, although there have been some that have made that case. I think that this passage is referring to personal retaliation and revenge. It's a prohibition against retaliation and revenge. So I don't think it's talking about responding to criminal behavior or military aggression. That's not what's in view here. It is not talking about putting yourself or your loved ones in mortal danger. But he is talking about not seeking revenge. And he's talking about living a life of forgiveness. He's talking about intentionally living a life to overcome evil with good. That's what's in focus here. You may remember that last week we talked about how Jesus, when he was commenting on some of the laws, he kind of had a little formula for how he did it. He would say, "You have heard it said," and then he would give one of the laws that he was going to comment on. And then he would say, "But I say to you," and then he would expound his view and his teaching about that law. And we talked about how frequently, in fact almost in every case, he's sort of raising the bar on these laws. Well, in the reading that we have today, we have the last two of six. He does this 6 times in the Sermon on the Mount. He has six of these times. And the reading today is the last two. And so as Jesus begins, he starts off saying, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." I want to begin by, I want to first for a moment to consider what this meant in the Old Testament before we consider what Jesus intended or was saying about it. See, in the Old Testament times, it was not uncommon that if you got on the wrong side of someone, that they would take revenge on you. Now, it's also not too uncommon today either. But there's a story in Genesis about this where Jacob, sort of illustrative of this, where one of Jacob's daughters is raped by a man from a nearby village, nearby tribe. And to try and make amends, they said, "Well, why don't we let them get married?" But Jacob's sons deceived them and pretended that they were going to allow that, and then they killed them all. They slaughtered the whole tribe, took all their animals, and it was a retribution that was way over and above what the crime was. Now, the Bible doesn't look kindly on this. It's not sanctioning this. In fact, Jacob rebukes his sons for it. And so, but it is an example of what revenge and retribution out of control is. And so when Moses gives this law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, what he's saying is, let's put it in today's vernacular, let the punishment fit the crime. Don't, in executing justice, don't go beyond what is equivalent to the offense. Be bound. Be measured in that. The law was to put a cap on that and to restrain vengeance and leave vengeance in the hands of God. So that's the intention of the law. But then, when Jesus comes along in the gospel lesson, he starts off with that, and then, as we've seen before, he raises the bar. Let me read it again. You've heard that it was said, an eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. So in this teaching, Jesus is challenging us to go beyond the mere eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and to act redemptively in situations and circumstances that present themselves or that are thrust upon us in life. In other words, he says, don't react to a situation, but respond in a way that brings God's redemptive grace and love into the situation. That's the higher law. He's not abrogating the other, but he's placing a higher principle for his disciples whom he is instructing. To flesh this out a little bit, let's talk about one of the very examples that Jesus used. He said, one of his examples, he said, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, this is referring to the fact that Roman soldiers were allowed to press people into service for them. They could force, at any point, if they were traveling from one town to another and they had a bunch of baggage that they were carrying, they could force someone at any moment, at any time, to drop what they were doing and to carry their load for 1 mile. They couldn't do it for more than a while, but for that mile, they'd have to press somebody else into that service. Well, this was resented by the people. Of course, the people resented having the Roman occupation anyway. But Jesus is referring to this when he says, if someone presses you or forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2. In other words, if you were to respond that way, the first time you're pressed, you are kind of under the duress of the one who's oppressing you. But if you choose to go the second mile, you're turning the tables. What you're doing is now moving it from the realm of doing what's being required of you, to doing sacrificial service in the name of the Lord. Can you imagine the response of the Roman soldier when, after he has forced someone to walk 1 mile, the person volunteers to carry the load for a second mile? Imagine the soldier would be wondering, what in the world's going on with this? And maybe he starts to ask him, why are you doing this? And the door then is open for the disciple of Jesus to say, I'm doing this because of the love of Christ that constrains me to love my enemy. You see how it turns it on its head. It totally turns the thing on its head. The choice to walk the second mile changes the situation into an act of oppression, into an act of sacrificial service. It brings God's redemptive love and grace into the situation. And because the person chose to walk that second mile out of love, it drains the bitterness and the rancor out of it as well. Let me give you a more recent example of what I'm talking about. Kay and I have some friends from a church that we used to attend a number of years ago. And this couple, when they were younger, and they had young children of their own, they lived this out in a very remarkable way, because at some point their home was robbed. They had a home invasion and their house was robbed. And they caught the man who did it. And then in the process of going through the trial and everything, they came to learn that there were children involved in his family. And the wife, I believe, was already incarcerated for some other charge. So when he was sentenced to go to jail, there was no one to take care of the kids. So they did. They took the children into their home. And they raised them for the period of time that he was incarcerated. And what they were doing, of course, was turning the other cheek away. They were returning good for evil. Instead of remaining the victim in the situation that was thrust upon them, they turned it around to a redemptive act of God's grace and love. You see the higher law that's in there? The other one was already there. They were being punished and rightly so, punished for the crime. But they didn't stop there. They brought God's law of love and grace into that situation and transformed it into a redemptive, sacrificial act of love. And you know, their daughter, their daughter, was so impacted by that as she grew up with these extra brothers and sisters. She ended up, as she grew up, going into law school so that she could work with the children of incarcerated people. And the couple themselves went on to do volunteer work in the inner city school where they were helping underprivileged families. The whole situation, it transformed them as well, you see. So this teaching about Jesus then is about how to respond to things that happen to us, you see. Things that are thrust upon us. In the teaching, Jesus challenges us to act and not react in situations. The rub, of course, is that what Jesus is teaching here goes completely against our human nature. It just does. That's why I opened my comments by saying this is perhaps one of the most challenging teachings in all of the New Testament and of Jesus, because it goes so against our nature. But not only do that, but because Jesus is, on the one hand, not just teaching us to seek revenge, but also to go beyond that and act redemptively. So as St. Paul says in Romans, he says, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. See the distinction there. Now that Old Testament lesson that we had today also speaks into this. The lesson is one of the places where the Old Testament takes the Ten Commandments and kind of unpacks them and enlarges how to live this out. In fact, a lot of Jesus' teachings come out of this particular passage that we just heard. We find a series of commands that all focus on how we treat our neighbor. And when this passage, when Leviticus enlarges the commandment about murder, it says these things. Do not endanger your brother's life. See the enlargement there? Do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not seek revenge. Do not bear a grudge. That's all in that passage. That's where the Levitical law is unpacking the law not to murder. And remember, Jesus has already said, if you're angry without cause with your brother, you've already murdered him in your heart. Jesus and Leviticus here both are bringing the law not just to the outward behavior, but to the inward attitude of the heart. It's an inward focus that causes all of us to say, Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Jesus does not want us to grow bitter and angry and resentful towards those who have wronged us, because that bitterness and anger harms our soul. It harms our soul. When we have been wronged emotionally and hurt, we can become bitter and resentful, and then we end up lashing out on others, and there's this vicious cycle that begins to happen. Now, I think I may have used this story before some time ago, but many years ago when I was attending a different church, another church, before I was ordained, I was going through the line to speak to the pastor who had delivered the message. And of course, there was a lot of people going through, and when I got up there, he kind of took my head off. I asked him some question, and it's sort of like he unloaded on me. And I was hurt and wounded, because I just kind of came out of the blue. And so I just kind of I went home as quick as I could. Well, that afternoon I got a call from him, and he apologized to me. He said, I just want you to know the person in front of you kind of attacked me, and I was wounded, and so I was still dealing with that when you came up, and I'm sorry, I just unloaded on you. He said, you got somebody else's mail. I think that's the way he put it. He put it to me. But, that's an example of how when we've been wounded and we take it to heart, and especially if we nurse it, you see, if you nurse it, then it grows and it becomes something that can bind your soul. So what's at the heart of this also is the command that Jesus gives us to forgive. To forgive. And we need God's grace to help us to live lives of forgiveness, because again, that goes against the natural inclination of our soul. But God calls us to forgive and gives us grace and aid when we need help. If we turn to Him, He'll give us the grace to forgive. The cycle can be broken if we choose to go against our natural inclinations and act redemptively. If we take the initiative to act redemptively in these situations, we, in essence, guard our hearts from allowing a root of bitterness to grow and get lodged down in there that can affect our whole lives, because there are people who, from wounds from years and years ago, are still, they don't even know that it's associated with something that happened years ago, but it's still affecting their lives, and God wants to heal and restore those broken places in our lives with His grace and with His love. So when we've been wronged, before we react, I think what Jesus is saying here is take it to the Lord in prayer and ask Him how He would have you respond. There's a quote in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, in which he's talking about loving others and whether or not we're loving one another. And he says this. He's talking about minimizing our feelings. Okay? He says, do not waste your time bothering about whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love them. If you injure someone you dislike, you will find yourself disliking him more. If you do him a good turn, you will find yourself disliking him less. C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. Well, like our friends who took on the children who robbed them, instead of reacting, they acted redemptively. Instead of stewing in anger and bitterness, they allowed God to turn that situation into a testimony of God's redemptive grace and love. But sometimes the wounds are too deep. We need the grace and help of God in order to forgive. We can't get there by ourselves. There's another story that came from the little publication, Our Daily Bread. Y'all familiar with that little book that has little short stories? Well, there's one in an issue from back in 1992 that explained that during World War II, Adolf Hitler had commanded all of the religious groups in Germany to unite. And he did that so he could control the churches. And one of the denominations in Germany, the Brethren, some of the churches, about maybe perhaps half of the churches, complied with that. And the other half resisted that. The ones who complied, they had a much easier time during the war. They weren't persecuted by the Third Reich. But the ones who resisted were persecuted. There was hardly a family in that group that didn't have someone who died in the concentration camps. And then after World War II, the church wanted to come back together. And there was deep resentment and bitterness from the wounds that took place at that time. So the leaders from both groups decided that they would meet and to try and work it out. But they agreed that before they met, they would spend time, each of them, a couple days alone, fasting and praying and seeking the Lord with regard to their own hearts. And Francis Schaeffer, who told about this incident, asked a friend of his who happened to be there during that time, well, what happened next? What did you do next? And he said, well, when we got together, we found that we were already one. Because in that time, as we individually confessed our hostility and our bitterness to God and yielded it to Him, the Holy Spirit created a spirit of unity among us. And love filled our hearts and dissolved their hatred, and the church reunited. Well, that's a work of God. That's a work of God's grace coming in and healing. And oh, how we need the healing grace of Jesus to come in and heal and touch the wounded places of our lives, that we might know His love and grace and be able to better reflect it out into the world. Well, of course, Jesus, giving us this teaching, challenges His disciples. But He, of course, is the supreme example of His own teaching. When He was arrested, He did not resist. When He was accused and interrogated, He opened not His mouth. And from the cross, He prayed for His persecutors and forgave them. Father, forgive them, He says, from the cross. Was Jesus passively allowing all of these things to roll over on Him? No. He willingly embraced the cross and took our sins upon Himself. He was intentionally acting sacrificially and redemptively in the events of His passion that were thrust upon Him. And if we see it rightly, we'll know that He did that for us. And this is where the power of His grace can begin to make inroads into our own hearts. Because when we see that, we must have come to understand that He did it for us. He did it for you. When He said, Father, forgive them. That was directed to you and me. Because your sin and my sin put Him on that cross as much as the hammer in the hand of the soldier and the spear, as much as the religious leader that resented Him. Understanding this and taking this truth into our own hearts changes us. It changes us. That's where the power and the grace begins. And then He can begin to unwrap the bondages that we've created even over a lifetime. You see, His love, as He redeems, He acts redemptively in our own lives so that we can then begin to act redemptively in the world. Sermon on the Mount was a teaching that addressed to those who were His followers. And Jesus said that if anyone would come after Him, he must take up his own cross and follow Him. when we respond in love and choose to act redemptively, when we are wronged, we are carrying our cross. We're walking the second mile when we do that, you see. You know, there's another story in the New Testament about a man who was forced to walk a mile. Maybe it wasn't quite a mile. We don't know a whole lot about this man, but we're told a few things about him, just a few. He was from North Africa, in the area that we would today call Libya. In fact, we're told he was from the city of Cyrene, which was a large Roman city on the Mediterranean coast there. And we're told that his name was Simon. Listen to what Luke says. As the soldiers led him, Jesus, away, they seized Simon of Cyrene on his way in from the country, and they put the cross on him to carry behind Jesus. Now, Simon didn't ask for this. He was minding his own business that day, coming into town, and he's going in the gate as they're bringing Jesus out the gate, and they pressed him into service and forced him to carry that cross. They forced him to walk a mile. But here's the question. Did Simon walk the second mile? Did he walk the second mile? Did he become a follower of Christ and take up his own cross and follow after him? That would be walking the second mile. Well, we don't really know for sure. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie by Mel Gibson called The Passion of the Christ. He does a really handles that scene very remarkable way. He shows how Simon doesn't, he's not wanting to do this when he's pressed into it, but somehow as he's carrying the cross of Jesus, there's this interaction that he has with Jesus as he looks in his eyes. And Simon is changed in that movie. Well, we don't know for sure. There's some, what do you call it when there's some creative license. Thank you. Embellishments, yes. But worth reflecting on, and of course there is some hint in the New Testament this may be true or something like it, because when you look at Mark's version, listen to what Mark says. Now Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and the soldiers forced him to carry the cross of Jesus. See, in Mark's telling, it's Simon's name, but Simon's children are named. Named people in the New Testament are significant because they were probably in the church. They were probably in the community of faith as those stories were being told, so that when Mark writes it, he says, Simon of Cyrene and the father of Rufus and Alexander. They knew them, most likely. It's a little inference there, but I think it's reasonable. Both Simon and his children are named, which means they most likely were known by the early church and the gospel writers, which means, if that's true, Simon did take up his cross and follow Jesus, and he walked the second mile. So, when we're wronged and we respond redemptively, we, like Simon, are not only carrying our cross, we're carrying the cross of Christ. And when we suffer in this way, Jesus is with us, and we encounter him. Paul calls this the fellowship of his suffering. It's not something we like to think about, but it's like tasting the sufferings of Christ. That's what Paul's referring to there. Not the prosperity gospel. Right? There's a fellowship of suffering that's part of the calling that we have as believers. And the assurance that we have in this is that when we go through seasons like that, or things in life get thrust upon you, that He is with you. And if you choose to act redemptively, you discover His grace in the midst of it in wonderful and surprising ways that goes way beyond an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus uses it, you see. So let me conclude just with a few summary points here. Try and pull it all together. What Jesus is saying in this passage. He's saying when we have been wronged, learn to act, not react. Guard your heart by resisting the temptation to seek revenge or nurse grudges. Instead, go to the Lord and ask for grace to forgive and to deal with the situation. Ask your brothers and sisters to pray for you in those situations. We're here to walk with each other. Pray for the person who's wronged you. If you consistently pray for the person that's wronged you, it's hard for you to continue to harbor anger and hatred in your heart. Go to the person who has offended you and try to talk it through in a spirit of reconciliation. Sometimes that can work out, sometimes it can't work out. But the effort, it's encouraged. We should try. Try to say that. Ask God how He might want you to respond redemptively to the situation. Allow God to work in and through the situation, which means that you're surrendering it to Him. And know that whenever you might be called upon to suffer for His name's sake, that He is with you. He's already walked that path. He's with you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Until we give you first place, until we let you begin to fill us with your Spirit, renew us from within. Nothing matters, nothing's gained without your holy presence. Our lives are lived in vain.